the thing up a little bit, would you? This way. This way, yes. Perfect. Hello everyone. Hi everyone. This is Brothers of the Arcana, and as always, I am Alex Aldea.
I am Dave Ferrigno. Welcome back.
And with us today is...
My name is Brandon Kornbluh.
Excellent.
Would you like me to share some information about myself?
I would.
You have a promo first.
In due time. Promos.
Ad spot. That was quick.
It was good. Yeah, it was good. So our Dave, what's our cigar today?
Our cigars of the day. We have the Drew Estate Nica Rustica.
Ooh.
You have the standard there. I have the Adobe.
Because Dave's special.
Exactly.
And one for Brandon. Also, he has one. And we are drinking the Singleton 15. Little Scotchy action.
Ooh, just throw that anywhere.
Yeah, that's right. That's very nice. Thank you. We have a brief spot there. And with that, we want to welcome you to the show. Thank you so much for coming down.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
I'm
Cheers.
honored that you invited me.
Absolutely. We ply our guests with alcohol to increase their likelihood of being more forthcoming.
Hopefully, anyway.
Hopefully. So, without further ado, Brandon is a member of our fraternity. He's a Freemason, and it's a wonderful thing. We get a chance to meet with incredible folks in our fraternity. Brandon's an obvious example of that. We've gotten to know him better over the past year. And tell us a little bit about yourself and
Sure.
your path.
Well, I guess I'll start with my career. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist. I'm a social worker. I've worked in intensive treatment. I've worked in schools for about 8-9 years. I'm a trauma therapist. I'm also a mindfulness and wellness counselor, certified in both, and play therapy. And anything I was able to, dip my feet into, I tried to, with the goal of expanding the breadth of my impact. But ultimately, I think what says more about who I am is that I'm in this field because from an early age, I felt an innate sort of instinctual calling to help people in whatever way I could. I recognize that our populace, our species, specifically over here, is plighted with various things. And
Plighted, you say?
Yeah, for sure. And so I was compelled to help in the way that I thought I could help most. And that was as being a psychotherapist, mostly focusing on working with kids. Because, adults are lost. There's no undoing it. Don't waste your money.
That is very fatalistic and somewhat disturbing. But hey,
no coincidence.
That's why they invented booze. Okay, so that's an awesome thing. I wonder if you could tell us part of your background. I know was growing up in a tough neighborhood, having some issues as a kid, and then moving forward. I'm sure that must have played some part in your desire to, number one, work with kids, and number two, explore for yourself the potential of psychotherapy, what that can offer. And could you talk a little bit about maybe that little arc?
Yeah, I'd be glad to.
Sure.
This gives me the opportunity to share with my friends here even more about this story, because I actually grew up in a beautiful neighborhood. I grew up in White Meadow Lake in Rockaway, New Jersey. It was beautiful. My family didn't have a lot of money. My parents separated before I was a year old, and so I was with my grandfather. So what I've experienced growing up was mostly a result of family traumas and separations, and then having to live with different people and be split amongst family members. That's super common for kids, especially nowadays. I mean, more and more so each year. Typical families are not as common as they were, decades ago, and especially in the 50s, I think was the height of the American nuclear family. So it's not that I have, a story there that is, upsetting or disheartening. It's pretty typical. The part of the story that I did live in tough areas, but that was all by choice. That was through my work. I lived in the Bronx for a few years, working as a direct support professional, helping adults with developmental disability and cognitive impairment with co-occurring addiction issues. And I went to school at Seton Hall and lived in Irvington for a little while. So lived in upstate New York, and I worked on south side of Syracuse with kids, who we would call underprivileged. I mean, they weren't, though. They were just typical kids. They didn't have as much access to resources. It was one of the reasons I was there. So my experience living in more urban areas, that was all by choice. It was to help people who I thought at the time needed it most. Now I work in Chester, New Jersey. Actually, I share this in common with Bell Works here. I came today from Chester. Bell Works also was in Chester in 1928.
Wow, okay.
And moved
Didn't know
over
that.
here in 66. Yeah.
Were they really?
Yeah, it's the historian side of me. I had to research where I'd be joining you. But my journey to entering into this career and really my path had a lot more to do with a series of existential crises that I experienced growing up. So for one, I was born into a Jewish family, so I'm culturally Jewish. And right before I was going to be bar mitzvahed, my father converted to Catholicism. And so it's about a month before I learned this.
Don't you hate it when that happens?
Yeah, I don't know anybody else that's happened to. But it was good for me. It was really good for me because it forced me to ask questions that most people don't begin to tackle until much later in life. The question didn't get resolved, obviously, when I was 13. But I delved into what would then be a lifetime, and continues to be a search. That's not true. I shouldn't slight myself to say that I'm searching anymore. I don't really feel that I am searching. My journey took me to almost every major world religion. That's not true.
I'm sorry, I put
Echo.
the volume up. Yeah, it was crazy, wasn't it? Our first time live going, folks. Sorry about that.
Pretty
We're
cool. I'm honored.
doing our best. Please
So,
continue.
Thanks, Alex. So I after that I went to Israel and to Mount Masada, and I was bar mitzvahed at the Western Wall, and I think my grandparents were trying to solidify my appreciation for my culture and my heritage. But they also took me all over the world to Templar sites and quite a few other places that I didn't realize the significance of until later in life when I was studying theology and art history and studying philosophy and anthropology. I'll fast forward the story. I wound up going to a Catholic school, to Seton Hall University. One of the requirements of my degree, which was social and behavioral science, with concentration in psychology, I studied theology there and anthropology and sociology. Of course, I became a social worker and got my graduate degree from Rutgers University. So I found Thomas Aquinas, right? So if anybody's familiar with Thomas Aquinas, you'll get my point here, and that was that after reading the Bible and the Torah and the Quran and the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita and Tao Te Ching and all of these religious and philosophical texts from all over the world, I had an epiphany, and that is that, well, we're all talking about the same thing. Everybody is talking about the same thing. This human experience is not, we surely have unique experiences, but the human experience, the quintessential human experience, is not unique to any one of us. We all have the same innate and instinctual drives. We all have the same primitive backgrounds, and we're all looking for enlightenment in some context or another. And the plight that I was referring to before, I think, permeates a lot of our daily experiences. And I hate to say that, given that we've had some tumultuous times throughout our history, human history, now is a time that is fraught with fear. There's not Vikings or Germanic tribes knocking down our doors, but I would posit to say that that people are more afraid than they've ever been. I think that's true terrorism, is terrifying our public.
So from that perspective, if you feel people are living in more fear than ever, how is that impacting society as a whole today?
Oh boy, Dave. Well, it forces us to make decisions with our amygdala, not our neocortex. And the beauty of, so I'll speak for a moment, from my lens, which is mental health and psychotherapy. And if you don't mind, you humor me sharing with you some of the work that I do with kids. I've done it with adults, but
Absolutely.
It's nice and simple, and I think maybe resonate with your viewers. So I teach kids. I'm a humanistic therapist. So my goal is to help people understand the way their mind and body work. It's Eastern, right? Which has only been widely accepted in the last few decades. It's pretty hokey for a lot of people prior to that. But I think general populace has recognized that Eastern philosophies and healing and medicine worked for thousands of years in plenty of places. So why shouldn't we tap into that spiritualism and that holistic practice? I'll give a personal example. My wife and I were going through IVF a few years ago to have our daughter, and tried all kinds of things, and she wound up participating in acupuncture for blood flow, and not more than a week later did we find out that we were pregnant with my daughter. I have a few other explanations for it, but I would be inclined to believe that it helped, and why not? And just the fact that she felt secure and connected to her practitioners and connected to me and hopeful may have aligned her body in such a way that she was prepared for that. So, holism, we're not so simple as to say that there's one solution to any given problem or that we should only attack any issue from one direction, right? So the work that I do, both privately and in the school system is, of course, I'm only working with students in the capacity that they are my students, and I want them to function well in the academic environment. But, occasionally there's room for me to teach some psychoeducation. And psychoeducation, humanistic psychoeducation, removes blame and guilt, right? It doesn't make you feel wholly responsible for your poor choices or for conflicts that you have with other people. It helps you understand that you're human. This is how your brain works. These are some of the functions of your brain, some of the parts of your brain, and what you're tussling with in any moment, given any decision. The symbolism, the allegory of like a devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other. There are parts of your brain that are actually in conflict with each other in any given moment. So I'll speak to this symbol that I use of a traffic light, an inverted traffic light, when I try to teach the kids about the different parts of their brain and about what might be motivating any given decision. So the amygdala, right, the reptilian brain, right, we'll call red. Makes sense? It's where fear comes from, right? The 4 Fs, fight, flight,
freeze,
and sex.
And sex?
Yeah, is the 4th F. Let's call it
right.
fawn. We're gonna call it fawn because it really
Fornicate.
happens. Fornicate. No, it's fawning. What it really is it happens in domestic violence cases.
No fornication here.
When an individual is so afraid of perhaps their violent or abusive partner that they actually fawn in the hopes that the abuser will be more gentle to them. So one of the fear responses actually is fawn. That was a joke, the 4 Fs, that was a joke that my AP psychology teacher, Ms. Knoll. Hi, Ms. Knoll.
Hi, Ms. Knoll. Is
She's
Ms.
awesome.
Knoll listening?
Yeah, she probably will. I still talk to her. She's a wonderful woman. She really had as much influence on me in my upbringing as plenty of adults did. So I credit her. Yeah, she wrote me a beautiful college recommendation letter. Yeah, wonderful woman. And she taught me more about psychology, actually, in high school. And I think I learned, no offense to my professors at Seton Hall, but
Who are also listening, I'm sure.
Probably aren't listening. No, I don't know. This would be blasphemous. So she taught us about the amygdala and different brain functions and the 4 Fs, right? So survival responses. So it's important to recognize that the reptilian brain, the amygdala, is in almost all organisms. The goal of the amygdala is survival, right? It's to get individual organisms to the place that they can reproduce. And then after that, it doesn't really have all that much function besides maybe some more evolved creatures to keep us alive after that. But once we've met our goal of reproduction, the amygdala's purpose is mostly satiated. After the amygdala is the limbic system, which we'll say is yellow. The limbic system is responsible for emotions, connectivity. An example of animals that really have a strong limbic
That's a
system.
cerebellum.
Cerebellum is as you're moving up into the neocortex, but
Wrong again, Dave.
that's okay.
What else is new?
But the limbic system, like dogs are a good example of organisms that really depend on their limbic system to create connections to people and to connections to each other, pack mentality. And then the neocortex is like the green light. This is where logical decision making comes from. And then I think this is where we maybe delve into the esoteric. Humans are unique in that they have a frontal lobe, right? So what separates us from other organisms is this right here.
The third eye or the pineal
third eye
gland.
or the pineal gland, right? That's the frontal lobe. So, in my work to help my clients, my students, be less fearful, because again, there's not warriors at our gates. There's not, wolves fighting against us for food or sustenance. But for some of these kids in the hallways, it's almost like a pack of wolves is at their door, with regard to bullying and the pressures of social media, et cetera. And adults aren't free from that. There's inordinate amounts of pressure that comes from social media and people's connectivity to. There's benefits, significant benefits to globalization, right? Technology is our potential savior and bane of our existence, our demise, our inevitable demise. But the goal of the humanistic psychoeducation...
That's pretty dark, too. You
That's
just,
dark.
You sort of just slide that right by, didn't you?
Alex,
All right, just
I'm
slide
not a
that by right by.
therapist because I'm this rainbows and butterflies type guy.
Listen, you
It
come
was a
off as
calling.
very... Doesn't he come off, he's like super slick? He's like, he's got this voice, and it's like this thing that he says and does, and then you're just like, society will end, but you're going to be fine with
listen
it because
close
I'm
enough.
talking like this. No.
It's a call to action, Alex.
So you're friends with your elementary school teacher who's going to
My
be
middle
listening.
school psychology teacher
wasn't
was talking
listening.
about.
I guess
Yeah, it's
now,
okay.
now
That's
I-
not your job. Your
No.
job is just to ask questions.
Ask questions, exactly.
They're the listeners.
They're absolutely. Somebody's got to listen. So what about relationships that you've burned bridges where they've all just gone up in flames? Have you had those, or do you just
of
sail
course.
carefully through life?
The truth of it is, right, it's a journey. I've had growth. I wouldn't be the full on the hill now, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm able to look back and look out and be an observer now, but plenty of bumps and bruises and hard knocks. And in my first few jobs, I was pretty fortunate. I was a tennis instructor for my grandfather while I was a teenager.
Did he have a club or something?
He was a pro. He was a USPTR certified pro. Now I am also. Actually, I teach in my township. Thanks, man.
Very nice.
But no, I've burned plenty of bridges. I think I've always meant well. I think most people mean well, but I've had to learn a lot of tough lessons for sure. Generally, my goal is to do as little harm as possible, while also being a warrior of the light and a proponent of social justice, which makes it pretty difficult when you feel compelled to speak truth while also trying hard not to upset people. There's a tough line to walk in that effort.
That is a tough line. I think we're going to try not to get political today. I know that in a lot of respects, all of us are on the same page in a lot of respects, especially on the brotherhood end of things.
Right.
Which is really all that matters at the end of the day. A person's politics are their own. But yeah, I agree with you. Social justice, when you mention that word, it sends me tingling a little bit because it's got a definite triggering effect in the modern society, right?
As of the past couple of years, but it didn't
and maybe
prior
it
to that.
shouldn't, right?
I think it shouldn't.
Right. It means
I
a
think
thing.
being woke or awakened shouldn't have a political connotation.
Well, even putting those two things together as meaning the same thing would be maybe something people would quibble about, right?
I agree
because
with you.
woke and awakened, are they the same thing? I would say not.
Well,
but
in a common parlance, they're not anymore, right?
Right.
As a colloquialism, they are no longer the same thing. So, yeah, you make a good point there. I wouldn't want to pair those two things together, certainly not. Because I would not consider myself a woke individual, but certainly an awakened individual or an enlightened individual.
which ideally is kind of, I think, what we're all trying to be.
Right. I would hope that...
However path we try to get there,
I would hope that
irrespective
that's
of
all
anything
of
else.
our goal. Yeah, is
Yeah.
to wake up and understand the nature of our existence, is to wake up and understand that the strongest force in the universe is love and acceptance and connectivity with each other, and hopefully we're moving in that direction. That's my hope. At least that's why I'm doing it from a grassroots angle, right?
So circling back on the fear and all the social pressures everybody's under today, what would you state, or from your professional opinion, what would be the best way to overcome that fear and get out of this psychological warfare that seems to be going on?
What did Timothy Leary said?
Tune in, turn off,
on,
drop out. Yeah.
I would say that we're part of a machine, right? I think most people know that. Certainly your viewers are well aware of this. we're part of a machine, a media and political machine, and there are algorithms that are manipulating us on a daily basis. The consultants, I mean, there are Facebook executives that no longer work at Facebook that will, completely speak to the plights and perils of this new technology, new as of the last 15 years. Their consultants were all mental health professionals. They wanted to understand, how can we get people addicted? How can we get them to trigger their own dopamine release?
Wow.
So that they keep clicking? And it's all about ad revenue. So this is a big money machine.
Wow.
And our people are our products. And, it's a corporate endeavor, right? I think so. The idea is claim your own sovereignty, disconnect as much as you can, grow your own food, go hiking out in the woods. I just did today. Disconnect. And when I say disconnect, it's funny, again, colloquialisms, right? Mm-hmm. What I'm really trying to say is connect. Connect to universal energy. Connect to frequencies and vibrations with all other people and organisms and with nature. Disconnect, unplug. Let's call it unplug. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Unplug, right? Stop watching the dribble and taking in, your favorite news media source, which is creating an army to fight for their cause, which is not in your best interest necessarily. But what happens as a result of all that is it creates fear, and it creates dissension, and it turns us against each other, when really we need to be united. Ultimately, the way that our species is going to continue to propagate and survive on this world is if we work together. I mean, we are already at a tier 1 species. We could sustain life on this planet indefinitely. Why are we not, right? Why are the nations of the world not coming together to work for greater good, to work for peace, to help, create a balanced ecosystem with homeostasis? Well, it's not what some people want. There'd be equality in that.
That's a funny thing you say. So we started talking about the work of Claire W. Graves outside, which Beck and Cowan turned into another book on a color grading scale called Spiral Dynamics. And so the idea is, what do you consider part of your tribe and what is not part of your tribe, right? So as a baby, you're a 1. You just think about yourself. That's your only thing, And suddenly, at one point, you become a 2 because you become aware of other, right? Mother is bringing you food and other things that you need to survive. So now you're a 2 on the scale. You've evolved a little bit, if you want to call it.
Right.
3 would be most of the tribes of the world, the nomadic tribes, the tribes of the Old Testament, let's call them, right? Sure. Including the Mongols and the early Semitic peoples, and obviously all the battles that happened there, the Hittites and all those people.
Which really is nationalism.
Well, yes, nationalism everything's created, right? So it depends on what level you're creating, but we'll get there.
Social constructs.
We'll get there, right?
Sure, we'll get there.
So number 3 would be there's a me, there's a you, and there's a we, right? So the tribe is the we, but everybody else is persona non grata. Mm-hmm. Number 4 is all organized religions. So there's a me, you, we, and a upstairs that you're now responsible for, which is part of the larger group.
Or downstairs.
Or downstairs. And
depending on we respect all beliefs and faiths.
And of course there were, well, I'll tell you right now, I don't respect all beliefs and faiths. If you believe in downstairs, we got a problem. But anyway, the point being is that...
I thought you played D&D, Alex.
Well, we'll get to that. But the idea is that you have that, not only is there an upstairs, but there's an upstairs that gets funneled through a priesthood, right? An organized priesthood that now rules whatever it's going to rule.
Right, like a democratic republic.
Later. You. I see what you did there. Number 5 is robber baron capitalism.
Right.
Number 6 is, strictly speaking, socialism.
You jumped past robber baron capitalism really quickly.
I felt it was pretty self-explanatory.
Why does it have to be robber baron?
Well, it's because it's the most cutthroat version of capitalism, right? So it's the early forming of capitalism. What that was, it was like we're going to give you a market within which it's every man for himself, right? And it doesn't. We're not going to put strictures on how far you can go or what you can do to your fellow man within this microcosm of society
And the
to get there.
Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers gained too much power, and it was associated with names.
Well, to a
whereas
great
now
extent.
we're associated with corporations, which still have incredible amounts of power.
That's a thing. That's a thing. Number 6 is socialism, which is so as you see, each of the odd numbers is a singular thing. It's pointing at a singular idea.
Moving towards pluralism.
And the even numbers are committee based, let's call it, right? So socialism obviously being quite committee based, trying to look for the good of all,
Ideally.
ostensibly.
Though like a utopia,
Big failure in my
theoretically-
thinking, but yeah.
theoretically possible, but has never been pragmatically implemented.
Other than in small, like in communes or kibbutzes or things like that are manageable in that sense, right?
But degrees of socialism are, in plenty of countries. And in our country, the welfare system was, the New Deal was a socialist movement.
Sure. Without so was the Great Society under
Society.
yeah. And so at number 7, which is as high as he gets, is basically almost like an enlightened self rule. Like, yes, you are understanding that you are a person and your needs are interesting, but it's not a Hans Morgenthau thing like, action driven in terms of self interest. It's how can we do a win-win? How can we all
It's self-actualization.
succeed? But with myself not saying I'm part of the greater collective and not all that is, there is a singular here, right? But it's part of that, as you start to get into stuff. So, yeah.
Well, so from my lens, mental health, I think it's important to touch on Kohlberg's morality with this conversation, and that is such that from a young age, people are most focused on me, right? We're completely egoistic as babies and as toddlers. We see the world through our own eyes, and we can't even begin to contemplate or understand what it means to have empathy or to validate another's experience or even look past that they're not just all actors on our own stage. There are plenty of adults that we know who live that life and who have not progressed through those stages. The goal, ultimately, is having an abstract concept of morality. Not moral relativism, where morality and ethics change based on the scenario, but a child knows right from wrong. They know what hurts them. And one of the most fundamental and ancient rules of thumb is the Golden Rule. Right. In Akkadian, Sumerian, and Hebrew. It's everywhere in the world, ancient Hindi. Children understand that if it hurts me, I shouldn't do it to you. If we can move society more in the direction where we're not looking out for only ourselves, and to your point, understanding how we interact with each other and work together while still respecting our individuality, there's a concept. I did the lecture actually at your lodge, the Drumbeat Circle. Do you remember me? I'm sure we're going to talk about that a little later. Do you remember me talking about the concept of standing in, right? So it's the idea of, do you want to stand out from a group or do you want to fit into a group? And I shared with them during the lecture that the goal ultimately in society is for you to stand in, for you to stand proudly within a group, to have your own uniqueness and individuality, but to understand how that harmonizes with a group so that you can create music, right? So that you can resonate with those around you and be on the same frequency, right? All musical terms. So functionally, I hope, right, in my work, and I've begun to see other folks in my field and other folks in the field of mysticism and healing, try to help people move towards uniting, but also advocating for themselves, right? Also recognizing that they're important, their family's important, they have to care for themselves, but the moment they are taken care of and their family's taken care of, the next goal is to care for their brother, their neighbor, their community. And if all of us are practicing and living in this way, then ultimately we're all caring for each other. And our community doesn't end at the end of our street. Our community doesn't end at our town limit. It doesn't end at our state. It spills over into the next state. It spills over to the next nation, and it spills across oceans. We should functionally all be taking care of each other. At least that's
They-
my
so
feeling.
so that's the raising of that anthropological level of what is the other, how much responsibility do I have to the other, and if I do have responsibility, how do I actualize that while not giving up on my own thing?
It's fear again, Dave. You were asking before about fear. It comes down to fear again. This is all primitive. This is all instinctual. It's innate in us. It's about the myth that we're competing over resources. For a long time, I say we, Westerners, not Native Americans, but Westerners that came to the United States, came to North and South America, were competing over resources. Although we seemingly, with manifest destiny, had all of the resources at our disposal. But the whole goal, really, for those at the highest levels of power is to give the populace the impression that they have to compete for resources. And that if they don't punch the clock, work a 40-hour week, pay your taxes. And I'm not advocating for anybody to be deviant from society. I'm a sociologist. I want everybody to understand what's socially acceptable and appropriate and figure out how that fits in with everyone else. No one should be infringing on the rights of anyone else, theoretically. But when
Realistically, I would posit.
I think realistically, I think pragmatically.
If it stays
100%.
theoretically, it's not of much use.
Well, I think it's a little bit more difficult when you talk about corporations being individual, being individuals, and when you talk about
That's a tough fiction to go through, and I think to some extent that Chevron deference that we just talked about earlier really goes to at least potentially reworking the way the government works, or has been working lately, which was not, I think, constitutionally the way that it should have been working, but, it is what it is.
Alex, I bet every era, folks look at their current time and think it's about to hit the fan, right?
Oh, yeah.
We're at
Each
the
era
time
has
of
its own
change,
problems,
right?
and
But I just can't believe that we're not approaching the asymptote. I just can't. I feel like more
Who's
so
asymptote?
than ever. That more so than ever, we're quickly approaching some inevitability where there's going to be a paradigm shift, and unfortunately, paradigm shifts are never gentle or subtle. And I think,
why?
well, because why are paradigm shifts not gentle or subtle? Well, because of fear. Because why do you think? That's funny that you asked me the question when you already had an idea.
I do actually want to think about it. I kind of figured you'd probably say fear because we were talking about fear. Because you can't see past the event horizon. I think that's probably right. So if you look at the dialectic thing, there's a thesis, there's an antithesis, and they fight. That's what you just were talking about.
But there's a status quo.
Right, within that paradigm.
Within the
There's a
paradigm, okay.
thesis and antithesis, and they fight.
All right. So it's short-sightedness is what you're saying, ultimately.
Well,
You can't see past the event horizon.
I think we're
so you
conditioned to
grasp
be,
to the status quo.
in a sense, and the other people don't. And the
Yeah.
people that don't fight with the people that do.
Well, who are the people that don't? The progressives.
The ones not clinging to their guns and Bibles, I guess.
The ones that,
Right.
yeah, right. Well, they're the ones who want to move forward, whatever that means. Now, there's plenty of fear that can be drummed up from wanting to move forward into some unknown ground. Right?
The disaffected, the disenfranchised,
the disenfranchised.
the disgruntled.
Yeah.
Mostly ex-post office workers. No,
no,
I'm joking. But out of that fight, there gets created a new synthesis.
Right.
Right? So something happens, and it
And it's
jumps up to
tumultuous
the...
at first, and it
Well, that's
tears
it.
apart the fabric of society for a while until the pendulum starts to swing back to the middle, and then those who are looking to conserve their power try to figure out from what mounts they need to reassert themselves. But yeah, once there's a paradigm shift, hopefully it levels the playing field to some degree. Well, remember when Hogan talked about,
Just wrote that down everywhere. Yeah.
Sunbursts, sunspots, and also Eric Madsen talked about. There may be a time, there's reason for us to believe that there's going to be an EMP wave that takes out the grid and levels the playing field from a credit perspective, right? Where we're all back to basics. When it doesn't matter that I have a yacht, if I can't grow food on my yacht, I'm starving.
Right.
I might be able to sail across the ocean with the gas I've got in my reserve, but if I can't procure food, right?
But at that point, you probably wouldn't have any electronics to sail across the ocean, so you better be on a sailboat.
You wouldn't be able to navigate it. That's a good point.
Exactly.
You still have your fossil fuel burning in your engine. You'd be able to make it across, right?
Well, right, but if you needed some kind of spark from, to start the engine, as an example.
That's a good point.
Electricity.
Yeah, good point. There's other ways to make electricity, right?
Well, absolutely, but
Well, you know
does
who
the
would be
common
fine,
person
Dave?
know how to do that?
You guys know that should that happen theoretically as
Yeah.
brothers, come over to my house. I'm going to be growing food in my backyard, right?
I'm telling Monsanto. That's it. No, my point was, let's say this is, and I'll try to do this so that we could see it on. You could see it on. So this is
Our sponsor.
the Stone Age. Yes, this is the Stone Age, right?
Right.
And we're all traveling along the Stone Age, getting better and better at making better hatchets made out of stone, spears made out of stone, all kinds of things like that, right? And then at some point, like Mark said, quantitative accumulations lead to qualitative leaps. So you build, then it jumps up to another plane here, which is now the Bronze Age.
Yeah, a series of plateaus.
So it's not like we continue to just get better and better Stone Age equipment. At one point, all of this becomes irrelevant because it was a move to really this is what we're working for, right? That's where the evolution, in essence, happens. And then you go back to the quantitative amassing. So
Right.
socialism versus capitalism is still something on our trajectory that then leads to whatever is going to be the next thing,
It's a
which
pull
isn't
through.
either of those. Right, more so. But
Yeah.
in that moment, right there, that's where the event horizon is, and nobody can see what the next thing is because it's a whole other paradigm than anyone's arguing about.
Yeah, and it's such as the case with biological evolution as well. There's always these huge leaps. Change is not gradual, right? Change is cyclical. It comes in waves. Well, everything is waves, right? Everything is energy. Everything is flux. So yeah, point well taken.
Well, we're just getting at some very interesting things here, which I want to talk about more.
And I also think if we're obviously going back to the Stone Ages because our power grid's wiped out, you better go make some friends with the off-gridders and people that actually know how to survive and sustain themselves.
Unfortunately, in this world, in this country, you're going to need to make friends with people with a lot of armaments. Because when there's no resources...
In every country. If you don't have government, you better have armaments.
Right, but there's places where, folks will resort to agriculture again, and there's places where people will recognize that there's people who are resorting to agriculture and we can take their food. And I don't know what we're conditioning ourselves to be. Are we the ones who are going to produce, or is it going to be Mad Max here?
Well, if we saw what happened during Hurricane Sandy, it seems like Mad Max. Cause,
Yeah, it's worrisome.
we didn't
Well, it
have
might be
gas for a couple days, right?
It might be, so we could talk about briefly, maybe this is a good, do you mind if I get into...
Go ahead.
Which segue do you choose?
Right, there's so many segues, but there's one right in front of us, and that is that both Brandon and I will out us as role-playing fans.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Right, now you forget it, Brandon.
Nerd.
It's too late. It's too late. We have to tell everyone.
Being tied up in dungeons?
No, well, sort of.
Not me.
But
I'm happily married.
yes, no, we're talking about things like Dungeons and Dragons, Fallout, Warhammer 40K, all of
Any
these other.
media, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
Well, again, we're all talking about the same thing. This innate desire for some kind of fantasy where you have power to change your trajectory, where you can influence your environment and be a hero amongst your community.
Right. So with that, you've seen Fallout, the series.
Yep,
Basically, it gets at what we're kind of talking about now. So say there's an apocalypse, what happens? You have the vaults where everything's hunky-dory,
Right.
and they're sort of living this fantasy 50s existence where they're all going to get out there and can-do attitude and all that other stuff. Then you got the other guys
It's
eating...
super sardonic. It's so
Right,
cool to me.
eating each other up
Right.
in the above. And then other types of societies, like the Brotherhood, that's really more of a religious bent to it.
Maybe self-righteous to some degree.
They're all self-righteous. Oh, don't kid
Now
yourself,
you're talking outside
man.
of Fallout, right?
Don't kid yourself. They're all self-righteous.
Right.
One's maybe more than others, yeah. Yeah, they're really out there saying, this is the book.
This is how we do
This
it.
is the way.
Right. This is the ritual. This is the dogma. This is how you do it. This is the way.
Yeah, exactly. So you play. We haven't had the pleasure of playing D&D together as of yet, but I'd like to. Do you ever use any of the modalities of D&D or role playing in your therapy, or do you?
So that's actually a cool question. I thought you were going to ask the opposite. I thought you were
Okay.
going to ask me, do I ever use my my expertise and my training in D&D? And don't tell my
Ooh.
players, but yes,
And
I
you're
do.
secretly therapizing them?
Well, I've joked about it with them, but if you were to ask my players, they
Right.
would say that they've grown pretty considerably. I mean, one is like very gainfully employed in the career that he wants to be in since being part of the campaign. One got married and has also gotten a job that is exactly in his line of work, what he went to school for. Family members that hadn't seen each other or were never interacting with each other who are now together regularly. One of them became a Mason, was raised in my lodge. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of growth coming out of my campaign. But originally, that wasn't the idea. It wasn't my goal. I wanted to play D&D. I had never played before. I only started playing D&D a couple of years ago. That it was COVID. My
Right.
wife, my brothers had said my whole life they'd be like, "You'd be great at that. You're so creative. You can do accents and funny stuff, right? Games. Game theory, good at math, etc." And I was skateboarding and playing music and hanging out with girls, and I was captain of the tennis team and student government. I was doing stuff, right? I didn't have time for it.
Oh, they're doing things.
I was friends with plenty of people I was friends with everybody. I was friends with people who played D&D. I just didn't have time for it. Friends with people who played Magic. But then COVID, I had plenty of time. My daughter was a year old. My son was born. I'd put my daughter to bed, bathe her, put her pajamas on, night routine. My wife would take my son and do the night routine with him. And then I've had an hour or so, where I would do some research or do any work. And my wife and my brothers got me the D&D books. And I just dove into that and realized that the crazy thing about D&D is it's touching on, the myth, right, the mythology is touching on so many of the world's philosophies, religions, mythologies, anthologies. It's all in there. It's because it's an amalgamation of creators, right? So you're going to get the greatest pieces of work from an amalgamation of creators, like the Bible, for example, right? So your question was, I'm reflecting on the beauty of this game, and there's a lot of literature now in my field about how this game really helps people problem solve, resolve conflict, interact with each other in person, play out scenarios that they might be too ashamed of or feel guilty or feel too responsible to play out in any other format, even in role-playing in a psychotherapy session. But there's a buffer when you have an avatar where you're kind of free to play things out and experiment with you remember being a middle schooler, right? This week I'm a punk. Next week I'm a prep, right? And let me see which works. Who do they like? What do they?
Yeah,
which
depends
version
which
of me
is
do they
cooler.
like? Which is cooler, right?
And it's funny that they're playing that out to try to establish themselves within a tribe.
You're
So
right.
it's who the other likes, not
Yes.
what fits me the best.
Yes.
That's an interesting point.
And
of consideration.
self-exploration and experimentation has to come from within. When we're constantly looking at what's from without to measure and quantify or qualify our own value, we've entered into, in some cases, an irrevocable stage. You can no longer look at yourself as having inalienable rights, as being fundamentally virtuous. If you're only as good, it's where disorders like borderline personality disorder come from, where you measure yourself based on how others view you, and that's a disorder that destroys families. I'll actually volunteer to say that I believe that's what separated my parents is borderline personality disorder.
So not to derail the conversation on D&D here, but
Like Alex did.
yeah.
No,
How
it's
would-
totally relevant.
How would you say that pertains to relationships then? Because especially if you're trying to find acceptance, if you want your partner, as an example, to accept you for who you are.
Okay.
In some cases, I think, especially from a men's perspective or a man's perspective, I think a lot of times women want to change us. We're
Yeah.
always an experiment,
Well,
or a project to them.
My
Right?
wife is one of my D&D players.
Very cool.
Yeah, so she wasn't originally. I played with these guys for a while. So the issues that plague men, right? I almost wrote a book a couple of years ago during COVID. I started to. I was going to call it the fall of man, right? It really means the fall of our role and the pressure for us to sort of maintain our composure and not express our emotions if they're anything short of strength, is what society deems being strong, and how there's emotions that are easier. There's primary emotions, which are shame, guilt, jealousy, and And then secondary emotions like anger, which is easier to exhibit than sadness. And boys often feel like if they are sad, they need to act out to maintain an air of strength. And that's usually imparted on them by their parents or their fathers in some cases.
Why this hierarchy between shame and guilt are first tier and anger is second tier?
It's about what part of the brain it comes from, right? So if we remember that the amygdala is the fear center, right? And if you're trying to survive, you're not just trying to survive physically, you're also trying to survive socially because we're social creatures. So being ostracized or being a pariah in society instinctually was a death sentence. So those are sort of the resulting feelings. So the anger is a mask. The anger is a way to assert dominance so that we can maintain our role in society. I'm not going to be weak. I'm going to maintain strength so that you can't take advantage of me, so that you don't see me as a mark where you can steal my resources, steal my mate. So that's one of the explanations for why it's a secondary emotion. I'm realizing as we're having this conversation, I'm jumping over so many points. You guys ask great questions, and I wanted to talk more about, if you'll allow me.
We won't.
Yeah.
No,
Well, too bad. I don't really need your permission, right? I'm the guest here.
No, that's true.
If there's anything you
He's
want to
going rogue.
I'm going rogue.
Rogue
Been known
One.
to do it. Rogue One.
If you want to circle back on anything,
If you don't
by all
mind,
means.
yeah.
Sure.
I don't think we'll lose track. Talking to you guys is great. I relish in any opportunity to talk to you guys. I love your podcast,
Thank you.
Thank you.
and I'm honored to be on it. And we have great conversations, and this is a really good opportunity to talk about a lot of these things, but also to share them with people, because the goal really is for us all to become enlightened, for us all to evolve, and not just individually, right, as a species. But okay, so I'll circle back to fear, right? Fear. Because humans have access to our neocortex and we can think about things logically, it doesn't mean that the amygdala, right, and the brainstem, the reptilian brain are not still functioning. So plenty of people, in fact, I would posit that
He would surmise.
we all share in common now a global trauma, and that is, I'm not going to say COVID, but the isolation that resulted from COVID and the way COVID was handled. A lot of us share in common the trauma of 9/11 back in 2001. I was in high school. That shook me. So when you've shared global trauma in common, and as a trauma therapist, a licensed trauma therapist, I can tell you that trauma turns on the red light, right? So when I use a traffic light for students, younger students, to understand. The red is the amygdala, an upside-down traffic light. The yellow is the limbic system. The green is the neocortex. Neo being new, it's the most evolved, most new part of our cognition, part of our brain, and it allows us to think about things logically and problem solve. That's really the part of your brain that you want to be using when you're trying to solve a conflict between other people. But I imagine it's the case for you, for your viewers, certainly for me, that most people, when they enter into conflict with their partner, with a friend, with a family member, with an estranged family member, they're operating out of not emotions, right? I mean, it's emotions, right? It's their feelings. But ultimately, it's their fear. It's their fear of being taken advantage of again. It's their fear of being wronged, their fear of being hurt, the fear of looking weak. It all comes down to fear. And we move in such a way that we condition ourselves and each other to operate based on fear, not logic, right? Not to work together. I've given talks on road rage. People drive to, let's say, work or anywhere. They go out to lunch. They drive to lunch. They drive back. Road rage is prevalent. Most people experience road rage. If you guys drive behind me, you'll be enraged. But if
Are you
driving,
like super slow?
I drive the speed limit, and I listen to tunes. On the way here, ironically, I heard Soul Shine by the Allman Brothers, listen to Heart of Gold by Neil Diamond. It's like nothing's coincidental. I was supposed to hear those songs, right?
Yeah.
But if your life is bookended by these moments that are full of rage, right? Then your interactions in between
I have a lot of friends
those
like
moments
this.
are going to be full of rage. There's no way for you to turn the red light off and see with green. If you just arrived, flipping somebody off and getting flipped off at, is that how you say that? There's no way for you to... I have a rough day at work, and I blast, Foo Fighters and yell home, and I get home and hug my kids and wife and dog, and I'm good, right? But I expect somebody else to be able to curse someone out on the highway and then get to work and now teach a class of second graders. You know? So to look at your life and refine it in such a way that you're more peaceful regularly is good for all of us. So the work that I'm doing, right? I'm not a psychotherapist because I just love people so much and I just want to help them. It's because I recognize that we're messed up. You know, there was a lot of problems, and we are not nice enough to each other, and we don't say good morning enough, and we don't smile. We're not authentic and genuine in our interactions, and we need to be. Please, for my children's sake, I think we need to work on this. And the more that we're plugged in, and I look at schools that I work in, and kids are just they're playing Fortnite and Roblox and these games, and they're being socialized. Actually, a brief tangent. I did a training I mentioned to you yesterday when I spoke to you 2 days ago for the Department of Education during COVID. It was modeling SEL, social emotional learning, and called it Takes One to Teach One. Talked about great teachers. I referenced Mr. Feeney from Boy Meets World, who's like an epitome teacher that really genuinely loves and cares about his students. The goal there was forget teaching SEL to the students, teach SEL to the teachers. If they walk the walk and not just talk the talk, it'll have a lot more impact on the students. So I want people to understand this for my children's sake and for their children's sake, because the world is only as good as we are to it, right? We're borrowing this world from our children. We're in this world right now, borrowing it. It's on lease right now from our children. The generations ahead of us are going to inherit this world that is only temporarily ours, and we have to make the most of it. We have to make it better for them. Now, I made the mistake when I did that presentation for the Department of Education. I made the mistake of saying that during COVID, your children are lacking socialization. They're not being socialized.
Why is that a mistake?
Because the truth of it was they were being socialized. They were being socialized by guys my age who are playing video games in their parents' basement. I made a mistake. You can't not be socialized unless you're in a deprivation chamber. You're always socialized in some capacity. Even a boy that's raised by wolves is socialized by the pack. So our children were socialized during COVID, and we're currently seeing the results of that because most of them, parents were pulling their hair out, not knowing how to educate their children or even tolerate them to some degree. And so the kids were on screens, and we see the ripple effect of that now. But kids were being socialized by, again, guys my age that didn't have anything to do. They were playing Call of Duty before all these elementary school kids logged on, and they're still playing Call of Duty to this day. And the stuff that they were saying,
oh god,
the raging, the trolls. It's just so toxic. I still hear kids speak that way. They're these keyboard warriors. I've got some in my family who are totally comfortable just roasting somebody with their fingertips with a screen in between them. God forbid they ever say that to my face, right? But that's where genuine and authentic interaction was lacking. And we've got an entire generation of people who are impacted by that, who are now having to be re-socialized and taught how to interact with each other appropriately and respectfully. And I tell you, it's a lot of work. You know what we call it in my field, though? Job security.
You're not being replaced by AI?
I don't know that I know, right? Inherently cannot be replaced by AI. Unless it can feign humanism well enough, which maybe inevitably it will be there at some point. But I don't think so. And the reason why I don't think so, because there is a fundamental energy. We three of us spoke on the phone a few days ago, right? It didn't feel like this, right?
Not at all.
I couldn't be me then on the phone with you guys.
Right.
Because I use myself in my work. I am the energy that I carry with me. I am the field of energy that I put out outside of my body. You don't feel that over the phone with me. It's why telehealth in some regards is inferior to in-person work.
Without doubt.
You got to connect.
Although you bring up an interesting point, because I've worked with other energetic workers, and oftentimes working through Zoom, like if you're doing Tai Chi and you're doing Tai Chi healing, let's say, oftentimes Zoom can actually be a help to that, because all of the other intangibles, smells, other things that are not present. So you can focus much more on the energetics, which is very interesting that way. So
That's a good
sometimes
point.
that could actually be a plus.
It works for meditation as well, right? I would be a distraction to my participants if I'm guiding a meditation of theirs.
Okay, so now you're getting into something that I really wanted to talk about, which I found
Finally.
weird. And no, I want to talk about all this stuff, but I suffer from something called misophonia. It's a recently diagnosed thing.
Okay. Is that right?
It's where like certain types of sounds, like that whole ASMR thing,
It's
where it's like
physiological.
fight or flight,
Ah,
right? And so it's certain sounds produce that fight or flight response,
wow.
like nails on a chalkboard, other things like that.
Sure.
One of those things, and I went through therapy for other things in the past. Whenever the therapist would try to induce the hypnotic state, that hypno voice was one of those things like, you're getting sleep. It's like, it just creeps me out. Like even hearing it, it's something almost like a visceral thing that happens.
Yeah.
That's why I was wondering, and I found some great progress done with, for instance, conversational hypnosis, where that comes very this is what's happening kind of thing. That's what begged my question with, do you ever use any of the stuff that you've learned through role play to do in your therapy? Because that setting up a scene, right, where you're doing it where, you're bringing somebody into that work in certain respects, into the story, into whatever, and that's a ritual or that's a space where now that's altered and you're able to work with them like a workshop, right?
Beautiful, yeah. So short answer, yes. Yes, so much so. And I'll touch on the drum circle that I led for your guys last year, because yes, I have used D&D. There's a group of boys that I teach. I facilitate social skills groups, right? So Bowden's group process is such that when groups first come together, and that's in any capacity, corporate, all the way down to students in a classroom. When they first come together, they're storming. They're trying to figure out what's the dynamic here. They need somebody to sort of take control and make them feel safe ultimately. Turn off the red light, right? They need to feel safe. So once the storming is over, based on Bowden's theory, we begin to normalize expectations, right? Eventually we perform, okay? So eventually the group, I'm able to step back as the facilitator and the group sort of functions on its own, right? They take leadership positions and they maintain. The group's never mine. I never take ownership for it. I don't have any kind of authority over these kids. I'm just there to keep them safe and make sure the group is theirs. So they create the rules for the group and the expectations for each other. If one day a kid says, I think we should be able to chew gum in here, I say, well, how can you make that happen? Well, can I ask the group to vote? It's your group. You decide. Hey, guys, how do you feel about voting on chewing gum? Raise your hands. They just voted on whether or not they would vote on chewing gum.
Right.
So they have to own it. Well, there was a group of boys that was dysregulated, just coincidentally, dysregulated, all classified for emotional dysregulation for the most part, autism. Some of the more typical social skills routes or content that I would have taught to a different group worked all right with me facilitating it. I got some of that curriculum out and got them to learn some things. Never did they make more progress than in 3 sessions of D&D that I had them play. I simplified it a ton. I made the character sheet simple math. They also got math practice, but they actually wound up, I'm working at school. They wound up negotiating with each other, understanding the error of their decisions, their role play. I don't mean game role play, but their social role play. Wound up helping them generalize those lessons to their interactions outside of group, which is not something that I had as much success with prior to that. And there's a lot of literature in my field as of late. Obviously, there's not a lot of therapists that also coincidentally are dungeon masters. But I'm sure there will be more literature. Hey, maybe I should write, on this topic, but I don't have the time to experiment. That D&D is a great medium to provide counseling. I will probably in my career facilitate groups for people or for kids or adults that have difficulty otherwise engaging, with the content, with social content, without sort of this buffer in between. Same way that drum group worked, right? So what I was really teaching in there was call and response,
So
was
what-
understanding harmony.
We should probably at least preface what
Yeah.
we're talking about.
Yes, you're right.
So Brandon gave a presentation at my lodge last year where he basically put everybody in a drum circle, gave me as the worshipful master of the lodge at the time, or kind of like the president. I was just there leading the drum circle, and everybody else had the opportunity to join in with their own drums, but they could either do their own beat or go with the beat of the drum. So
Yeah. So actually what you were was the heartbeat, right? So less that you were the leader, right? Because you weren't dictating anything for them.
Right.
You were establishing a consistent heartbeat with which they could come in and stand in, as I was saying before. So there was no direction from you. They just had to sort of coalesce, right? Find harmony, right? Resonate at the same frequency. And they did. I mean, you had guys who were like afraid to get in the circle, who didn't have any musical experience, and said to me and you, I don't know if I can do this, right?
Right, more than one.
More than one.
Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
And actually, when we first started, nobody wanted to participate.
Nobody wanted to.
And then,
I wanted to.
but
You
then,
did
well,
want to.
yes,
I
you
see how
did.
you did.
But once we got to the second iteration
Yeah.
of the circle, everybody wanted
Everybody
in.
Right.
wanted in.
They're like, "This is so much fun."
You know, it actually had some pretty interesting implications on your lodge that same night and thereafter, and I hope it was beneficial to you guys.
Absolutely.
I think it probably was, right?
And that harmonization and everybody tuning into that frequency was truly special in a sense. It's like
I'm
everybody
glad,
just being on
yeah.
the same page.
Yeah, right. And it's not agreeing, right? It's not operating or walking in the same, in the same steps. It's just walking with the same rhythm, right? It's just operating with the same patterns, right? And respecting ultimately the heartbeat of the group, right? So therapy modalities such as those drum circles, and I should give credit to, that's actually Drum Beat out of Holyoke Institute. I tweaked it a little bit, but that's where I was trained. Holyoke Institute in Australia, I was trained in Philly. And then D&D therapy, which has not been coined by a psychotherapist yet, but I know it will be, because for a long time sand tray therapy was a modality. It still is. That works really well. Play therapy. People started using Minecraft in sand tray therapy, where they're essentially creating their world and then processing it and reflecting on it via a video game. And in this era, it's inevitable that we're going to start using games that kids are playing to teach them how to interact appropriately.
Wow.
Yeah.
So music got everybody to tune in, not only including people that were doing it for the first time, and they were totally offbeat at the very beginning, and then over time they started acclimating and then moving down this sort of funnel thing to everybody acclimating.
And it sounded great at the end.
And it did. It was a cohesive,
It really was.
together sound.
And maybe if everybody's lucky, I'll add a clip in here.
Yes.
So they can watch
Cool.
it.
Yes.
Oh, you recorded it that day?
We have a couple little clips and
really?
recordings.
He records everything in his life.
Absolutely.
Or take pictures.
I timestamp everything.
So he,
Receipts.
right.
Yeah.
So let's not get into that. So the idea of metaphysics, how that works in life, the law of vibration, and getting to understand how you can attune yourself to that like you would attune through a musical instrument. So that musical instrument was the practical reality of what we do metaphysically, I
So
think.
I agree with you. I mean, that's ultimately what we're talking about here. So the reason why the drums work well for it is because our let's first preface by saying that speech, those who have mastered rhetoric, right, and grammar, can more easily elucidate meaning, right? We can communicate better if we pick the right words. But ultimately, language limits us. If I could just get you to feel the way that I feel and understand what I'm thinking, it would be a lot more easy than having to figure out a way to put it into words, right? It's a challenge for me to put it into words, and then that's got to be communicated. And then in order for communication to happen, you've got to interpret my meaning, right? But when we were more primitive, we communicated with percussion. Our vocalizations were percussive and rhythmic. So it's actually instinctual for us to communicate in that way. Animals do it. I mean, you don't have to make a great leap to understand that we weren't eloquent, right? We weren't orators 200,000 years ago.
Sure.
Maybe some of our ancestors, but fundamentally, humans, whether you believe that we were put here, whatever form you believe that we got here to this place, we've become more eloquent over time. I think it would be fair to say. The drums are simple. They're primitive, they're rhythmic, they're percussive. And so it's simple enough for me to hit a beat, expect you to listen to it, and then copy it. That's call and response. I mean, there's call and response in all of our interactions. We're doing it right here while we're having a conversation with each other. I wouldn't want to play drum over your rhythm, just like I wouldn't want to speak over you when we're interacting in a conversation. It's important for the kids that I teach to learn that, and it was important that day for some of the guys in your lodge to learn that, amongst some of the other lessons that modality can teach. But ultimately, yes, we're talking about energy, right? Because, I mean, you said music, right? I mean, it's music. Music is the art of energy, right? You and I debated the other day about how involved math is. And that nature ultimately isn't precisely mathematical. But for the most part, rhythm, pattern, frequency, everything is waves, everything is energy. We understand now that we're electromagnetic beings. We know that. There's one of the benefits of modern technology, of Reels and Instagram and TikTok and all that, is that more people are watching these videos that are tapping into what have been givens for a long time, what have been well known in ancient mysteries, and that is that everything is frequency, that nature operates at a frequency. I watched a video of Sir David Attenborough talking about a bee and a flower, and how the bee moves to the flower, and it actually changes the frequency with which the flower's vibrating when the pollen's electrons jump to the bee and cling to the bee, and then when the bee leaves, the frequency of the flower has now changed so that other bees know that there's no pollen there left over. To think that bees and birds and flowers are operating based on frequencies and we as humans are not, I think would be silly or maybe ignorant, You walk into a room, and you meet a person with a certain energy, and people turn their heads. You remember that person, they make an imprint on you. That's not about what things they said, but the way that they made you feel, right? It's the way that experiences make you feel.
Well, and I think for somebody that doesn't understand that concept, if you ever walk into a space and you feel a bad vibe,
there you go,
or you feel like,
or in your gut,
yeah, exactly. There's something off about this person. It's like, I don't know, that person's peculiar, or awkward, or whatever else.
Something's weird about this.
Exactly, this guy over here.
So Thomas Ubriaco, past master of Essex Lodge number 7 in Caldwell, New Jersey, buddy, says music is pure math. He is a music teacher.
Oh.
Yeah. And he also knows the Fellcraft lecture, which gets it.
It's my favorite.
It is my favorite as well. That and doing the Royal Arch Principal Sojourner part. Those two, I think, they're remarkably similar.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of walking and talking.
Okay.
But
I hope they're similar in more ways than walking and talking.
That's mostly how they're
Of
similar.
that lecture is so beautiful.
No, the content is very different.
Yeah, very different.
But yes, I agree. I think that math is but math is an interesting one because math is the map, not the territory, right? So humanity, and a buddy of mine, Ramsey, who's sorry if I'm jumping around, but I'm trying to connect several things here.
And I think it's awesome that we have people.
Yeah, they can weigh in. This is our first live show. Thanks, guys, for watching.
Thanks for having me be your first live show. Is that
this
cool?
This is super awesome.
We threw you into the fire.
Yeah, I love it, guys. Thanks again.
So, my buddy Ramsey said that it's very interesting when you take the Pythagorean theorem, like the golden spiral and such.
Yeah, Fibonacci sequence.
Sequence, and you start to apply that. The 37th problem of Euclid and all of that, and you start to apply that to building principles, how humans build, you can get really far, and you do some fascinating things with it. When you then apply it to nature itself, you don't get very far, because there aren't any straight lines in nature. Math is too neat for nature,
Right.
on certain respects, right? So it's, yes, music is created by humans, and as such,
Math is an homage to nature.
right.
Is really what we're talking about.
So math, music, just like math, and maybe all art, is our poor interpretation of the divine, right? Or
Well,
what we see around us.
The more beautiful music doesn't necessarily land on every downbeat, right? I mean, the art comes out of respecting the math and putting your own flavor onto the math, right? Maybe I come in a 16th beat before every before every measure. So beautiful music, right, or complex, really interesting music, just like interesting art is not necessarily perfect lines and everything measured out with vantage points and perfect focal perspective. And I think that's what art is, right? Otherwise, we would just look at a piece of graph paper and think it's beautiful.
Yes.
But ultimately, it's the human touch or the natural touch. Because let's not forget, we are nature, right? It's our spin on the math. It's our spin on the concrete that makes it abstract. So yeah, I think we just agreed, right? Who knows?
Yeah, imagine that.
Wow.
So
What happened there?
I don't know. Something
good.
very, very
Your
strange.
friend helped us.
So from a perspective of, behavioral nature, whatever else, how would you define, gender? How would you define?
You want to go there?
I think so. Why not?
We're going to go there now?
Okay.
Well, where do you want to go?
All right. Well, all right. Let's set this up a little bit then, at least.
Okay.
So one of the things that we like to talk about, we find interesting on Brothers of the Arcana, is we're all brothers. We come from the same fraternity. That fraternity, to a great extent, focuses on men's issues and the way that men can become better men. Through the use of, I think, on some level, sacred space, like ritual space, other things like that are available, and other things. Also through a sense of community, also through shared interests like cigar smoking and bourbon drinking or Scotch drinking, whatever the case may be.
And essentially connecting to deity, becoming
Correct.
the best version of yourself
Yes.
by awakening
All
your
of
spirit.
that. So our fraternity is open to men, and men only. So, it posits one of the ideas of what is a man? Because that's starting to not be such an easy question to answer. Whereas
I think what you're saying
before
it begs the question: will we allow in a person who was born biologically female that has transitioned to male per our bylaws? Is that essentially where we're going here?
No. I don't want to go there, in fact.
No, definitely
at all. That'll be a question possibly for the future and not to be discussed by us. What I was
So
more
let's have this
interested in...
conversation not as it relates to masonry.
Correct.
Okay.
So the larger piece would be... and you know what? Maybe on the other podcast we can have that conversation,
You
which
set
relates
us up for failure.
specifically for that. But no, my point was larger in essence than masonry or in any particular fraternity or organization. Was we're under an obligation to understand ourselves as men and how we act upon society and teach other men how to become better men. So how do we do that with some of the modern tools that you've been able to bring along? And amidst what I think is a great amount of confusion as far as what is gender, what is it to be a man in the modern day, and so on. So.
Okay, so the reason you're asking me is because I'm a mental health professional.
Yes, that's part of it, but you also have that other bias of being a Mason and of being with other guys who are all trying to on their own levels figure out what that looks like for them, right? So it's not just an abstract. Here's my clients and here's me. This is also here's my brothers who are also sort of on some level struggling with this, or
All right. Well, gosh, that's profound. The question alone is profound. So thank you. So I'll say this because there's a bunch of questions that I need to answer here, I believe. First, I'll say that the way that I have brought in new Masons so far, I have ideas, but the way that I've brought in new Masons so far is by being authentically me. The two guys that have been raised in my lodge, was the gentleman that lives across the street from me and the guy that lives adjacent to me. So they spoke to me as neighbors. They interacted with me as neighbors, and they had questions like, "How are you this guy? Like, what you?" And I would tell them, and I would say, and I'm also part of this organization. And then they found themselves making their way over to the organization. I truly think, and it's not a chip on my shoulder speaking, but I think that that's really the way we should be doing it. We should be good men. We should walk the walk. We should be operative Masons, not just speculative Masons.
Okay, but what does that mean?
Oh, you don't want me to say that here.
I do.
want me
No, I want to know what it means for you.
What does it mean for me?
How does it show up for you?
So it means universal morality. It means being a good citizen. It means being a patriot. It means being a neighbor. It means being a caretaker. It means being a husband and a father, a friend, a brother, a son. It means giving people second chances. It means validating people's experiences. It means accepting people regardless of their perspective. It means validating people's unique experiences and not condescending. It means being egalitarian. It means all of those things. It means being a good human. So if we're talking about gender, the easy answer is, I don't give a darn what you are. I love you. It's love. It's just love.
Right.
Whatever you are, whatever you're going through, I love you. You're worthy. You're valuable. If you're then asking, what has society done to compel people to believe that they need to explore their gender when they're 5 years old, I would say that that's potentially dangerous, that a child can look at TikTok and go down the rabbit hole without parental supervision and ask a question about their sexuality when they can't even contemplate yet what that means. It's not developmentally appropriate for them to even be having that conversation or be thinking about that.
Sure.
It's not to say that there are not likely kids who will have to walk that path, but their mind is not at the place yet where they can really explore that. So again, there's a lot of questions here. I mean, how deep do you want to go into this? Because I was a gender specialist for a little while. Regardless of my personal views about it, I knew that my job was, mind you, let me help your viewers understand that I was also a therapist, a clinical coordinator for juvenile sex offenders. Didn't mean that I wanted to validate or justify their actions, but I wanted to help them heal so that less people were hurt, right? I did that for a few years. I actually was the clinical coordinator of a transitional living home where I got those young men into school, graduating, joining the workforce, and in a lot of cases, decreasing recidivism. So that's, I believe, how we heal the world. It's not by condemning them, right?
No, I don't think anyone's talking about that.
No, I don't
se,
think anyone's
right?
talking about that either. But functionally, I believe that. I mean, do you want to go into the conversation we had earlier, like the biological component of this?
I mean, we can.
Absolutely. I think...
Or should we shift back to men's issues in general?
Well, I think from that perspective, we could also talk about what it is to be a man today. How do we overcome traumas? Because obviously there's an urban, or I don't know, I think at this point there's so much pressure on men in society today.
Let me just take 2 seconds on exactly on Dave's point. So Brene Brown.
Yeah.
Familiar with her, right?
Absolutely.
I've read a lot of her stuff. Fascinating stuff. All about vulnerability, being vulnerable, coming from that space.
Yep.
There was a guy, he took his 2 daughters and wife to one of her book signings.
Okay.
And this is a story she tells, I think, pretty often. Most people probably are aware of it. But they all came up, got their book signed, everybody took pictures, and said, great. On their way out, the man stopped in, the father, and said, why don't you write a book about men?
Okay.
And she said, well, I mean, women are the vulnerable sex, and this is the problem, and, men are... And he had tears in his eyes, and he said, putting up the strong front for my daughters and for my wife, they get an opportunity to be vulnerable. I never do. So that part is killing guys on some level, because it's like saying you don't have an outlet, you don't have an opportunity. Potentially that's leading to strokes, heart attacks, all kinds of other things through lack of outlet in doing that. Obviously, the modern day is allowing all sorts of behavior that it wasn't allowing before, and we started talking about it's now creating spaces where that's not seen as quote-unquote deviant behavior. It's now seen as okay, appropriate societal behavior.
Yes.
Whatever, you want to have pink hair, you want to have whatever piercings you want to have the fourth F with whoever you want, that's fine.
Well,
but
we were doing it for thousands of years before the Victorian era, right?
Right. And that's all fine.
Yeah.
But the
as long
point,
as you're not infringing on others' rights or
correct,
or harming anyone.
Correct. No rape, obviously, or any untoward behavior.
Or even exposing minors or those without the capacity to understand. I mean, there's various forms of harm.
Pornography argument that we could potentially get into later, which is...
I don't think you'll have an argument.
No, just an understanding of that.
You're right.
But the larger piece is, and what's still taboo, and maybe one of the things Dave's getting at, and certainly Brene Brown said, was the ability for men to feel vulnerable.
Yeah.
And on some level, Masonry does give you that opportunity.
Yes.
Whereas in society, it's not okay. It's a huge taboo. Because if everybody felt vulnerable, then who's the guy on the wall with the machine gun watching for the Mongols, which are going to invade or whatever, if you're, let's say Han Chinese on the wall. Yeah, so.
Okay. Beautiful. Again, guys, I appreciate this so much. This is awesome. So I had a conversation today when I was facilitating a guided meditation on this hike that I took this group of middle schoolers on. And I asked for a debrief afterwards, and one of the boys said, I felt powerful. I felt in control. I said, is that what? He said, no. I mean, I felt in control of me. I felt like I had control over myself, over my emotions. And I took that moment to talk about gender and masculinity a little bit, not any further than what it means to be a boy. And being strong and being powerful doesn't mean exerting your will over someone else or coercing anyone or dominating in every way or showing how strong you are or being arrogant or condescending or talking to somebody rudely to control the airwaves. It's about controlling yourself, right? The greatest warriors, we've talked about Wu Wei, Kung Fu masters, Bruce Lee, right? If you allow someone else's words to control you, then anyone has the ability to control you. The strongest men are those that are in control of their emotions. Those are not the men that don't allow for emotional release or catharsis. Those are the ones that allow for those things. I also want to mention that, as you said, that times are changing. And I have a few examples of that, anecdotes from my own life. I shared earlier that I experienced existential crises. I studied theology, philosophy. I read all the masters. I read, the books of faith from so many different religions. And then I came back to my dad. I did. I came back to my dad eventually after years of, conflict. And now I have a good relationship with him. And he is, I don't know, he's evolved. He's an enlightened guy. Same thing with his dad. I had a conversation with his dad that went remarkably well. My uncles even told me at one point, don't waste your time, he won't change, this is who he is. I said, no, I have more faith in him than that. I think I know him really well, and he evolved, I think he would credit me to some degree, and it's really a beautiful thing. Actually, they're coming to visit my wife and my kids in a couple of weeks. I wouldn't have had them come and visit in the past, but now I'll be happy to receive them in my home, where I'm vulnerable, right? Where I'll be exposing my children to some of the same difficulties that I had to endure when I was a kid with these same people, except that I don't have any concerns anymore because of what I've assessed. So I mentioned the middle school and this trip that I took them out on today, hiking in the woods, mindfulness meditation. There's a watering hole in Chester Township. It's beautiful. Actually, Mendham on the border. They swam a little bit, let the white water break up, positive ions. It was a beautiful thing. Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, deep breathing, and then this really great conversation, processing and debriefing and all that. And these middle schoolers have a male principal. Well, this male principal, blue-collar guy, happens to be a brilliant dude. He's like big guy, firm. He happens to be one of the gentlemen that is most in touch with who he is. Out of all the guys I think I've maybe ever met. I mean, I've got social worker friends who are very close to me, clinical supervisor and like best friend of mine, same kind of guy, Thich Nhat Hanh and Alan Watts guy, and Zen Buddhism, and this principal who was comes from a blue-collar family with plumbers. He gets it. He totally gets it. I'm not too worried. Whereas a few years ago, I might have written a book or begun to write a book or at least an essay on the fall of man and this plight. I don't think we're in that stage anymore. I think that globalization has made us more aware. And your story, I've heard plenty like that with the situation with Brene Brown and the father that came up to her later. And that's profound, and I think men are having a lot of profound experiences where there's men watching us right now, aren't there?
I would hope so.
Maybe. You never know.
I
Are
would
we
hope
doing
so.
this in a vacuum?
No. But I think whether they're watching now live or there's a couple
recording.
watching now live. Thank you. I know it's during the day, so it's hard to get
Yeah.
folks to sit here for 2 hours, or close to. But I think his larger point was women in society and in all these, and I'll bring it back to what the Russians tried to do in communism. So they created under
Bringing
the
it back to that?
hang on. So the U.S. Yes, in essence, because there's just a lot of similarities.
Okay.
The U.S. The USSR they wanted to build a big house, right? This was the whole idea. They built a big house, and under the Soviet banner of the, they would have to start a. What do you call it? Each one of the various republics under the banner of the Soviet of the USSR would have their own room in the house. So their language would be part of the larger language system. Their culture would be looked at and treated as special and interesting. Their alphabet would be brought in. Now, they did that to some. They didn't do it to others. Whatever. There's a whole logical thing there. But that was the idea, at least on paper. But the only guys who didn't get their own special room were the Russians.
Oh.
So the Russians got the hallway. Well, they're like, well, of course the Russians are going to rule the house because they run the USSR. And yet they were overlooked when all the other particular special cultures got their own little place. So they all got their little cubby holes to exist in and to say this thing is ours. And the Russians sort of got everything, but really got nothing. Or sort of got nothing at the same.
I see.
So
I see what you're saying.
what it means to be
Discounted.
a man in this society right now, where it's like, well, you're a white man in society. What are you complaining
You'll
about?
be fine.
You've got everything you need, right? The whole society's bent to advantage you. Well, that's an easy, broad brush thing to say, but everybody has their own lot in life. Everybody has their own cross to bear. Everybody has that. And one of the taboos is still talking about men's vulnerability and issues and mental health issues. It's very interesting to say, and it's kind of interesting, Pride Month, and I don't know if this is true or not, so we will look this up, but Pride Month used to be Men's Mental Health Month. And that was rebranded, let's say, Pride Month. Assuming for the sake of argument that that's correct. And we will look that up to make sure that it is.
Well, I mean, if that is the case, then that's, yeah, I mean, it's an oversight, it's overlooking, it's discounting, it's very deliberate if that's the case.
Well,
sure.
and those two things exist, like they're both things that should be looked at, right? I'm not saying one's better than another.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is they both deserve to be looked at.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, then again, we have these months for different groups. It's a reparations, in effect, that we have a month, like Black History Month. I mean,
That's an interesting point.
that culture should be celebrated all the time. I mean, that's often the argument, right? To have a month, it's like, it's only important to learn about, like, Black history in February. Like, you should always be learning about it, right? Or, like, Pride Month, like, that we give. But you know what? That's what we do in this country, right? It's why Christopher Columbus, I mean, you know how that whole story with the 1920s and Columbus Day, and there was a lot of hate against Italians at the time, and so we decided
Right.
that Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer. It's a
Well,
way
he was
for us-
originally from Genoa. I mean, he was
he
an
was
Italian.
from Genoa, but he sailed for Portugal.
He sailed for Spain.
Yeah.
He sailed for Spain. He first went to Portugal.
They
to
said,
try to
"Go
sail."
take
They
a
said,
hike.
"Take a
Yeah,
hike."
absolutely.
He went to their enemies, and then he sailed for Spain.
Correct.
Yeah.
He sailed for Isabella.
Whoever
He's
funded
for
him.
Queen Isabella. Yeah.
Yes.
And then he had a Templar cross on his flag.
That's another thing. So we started to talk about that in the Hogan episode.
I know that.
To some
And
extent.
we talked
We did.
with
We did.
Grandmaster Hogan in person about that.
Very interesting dude, is he not?
He's-
Everybody watch that podcast.
He's remarkable. That's a great one for sure. Better than
Episode
mine.
4.
Episode 4,
Yeah.
1 and 2.
2 parts. There's 2 parts.
It's a two-parter.
Yeah. Any opportunity to meet or talk to or be a pupil of that guy is not an opportunity.
Interesting
to be missed.
dude. Yeah, no
That's
doubt.
for sure. So we try to make reparations, and we often miss the mark. Really, all people should be celebrated and validated, but you can't deny that this country was. I mean, it's just the course of history. It's not because we do dip into some like hot button issues when we have this conversation, like critical race theory, et cetera, talking about institutional racism. I mean, that's really delicate stuff, and I don't want to get you guys shadow banned.
No. It's an interesting critical race theory. Of course, comes from the Frankfurt School. So Frankfurt School was a lot of the folks that came over after World War II.
Yeah.
Where you had some philosophers, and I think it starts with a good idea: Socratic approach, question everything. Right.
That's right. Fundamentally,
I may disagree with the conclusions that they come to.
Yeah, and I often disagree with conclusions, but the problem is coming to a conclusion.
Yes.
When you use Socratic method, you're really just supposed to have a conversation and explore. It's when you come to a conclusion that says, like, ultimately, ubiquitously, this is what is.
Because now that leads to a new stagnation.
Yeah.
Right? That's a conversation ender, not a conversation.
Right. Now we're just complacent. We're okay with the fact that, and in the next 100 years, it's going to be white men that are downtrodden. Although very unlikely, right? Because functionally, this country was founded by, white Western men. And so it was founded with their principles and values in mind.
To a certain extent, I mean, you could say that, but it was really founded by very disaffected extremists, which really is why this country,
our forefathers.
I think, not mine, maybe yours.
Our forefathers as Masons.
Well, in a sense,
Yes.
also, but don't forget that those guys, I was talking about the Pilgrims.
Oh, you're talking about
So the Pilgrims are
Dutch.
well, the Dutch and the English as well. But you're talking about a group that was, I oftentimes joke with my friends who are in the Mayflower Society, which I think is such a whole thing. But I said, you guys should have had a bumper sticker on the Mayflower that said, "Too annoying for Europe," because they came over. They were really extremists. I mean, they wanted their own specific. I mean, that's like saying, and I'm probably going to get in trouble for this, but that's like saying Branch Davidians started the U.S.
Right.
Like obviously they were not that, but they were extremists of their day. Right, so they were not well looked at in England, not wanted in England.
During my existential crises, and I was reading, I also read Dianetics too.
Who wouldn't, right? I read Dianetics as well, and
but ultimately, I obviously came back to this place where I'm a monistic pantheist. I believe that
God bless you.
Thank you. Yes. All is divine and all is one. We're all talking about the same thing. We're all connected. So really, if we relate it back to gender, if we relate it back to men's roles, as we move through society, we get from. So why did we separate ultimately? I'm talking about from like a theological and anthropological perspective. It's when we got more specific. It's when we created dogma and doctrine. It's when we got more specific, created rules for each other, condemned behaviors, etc. When we got more specific, when we moved away from golden rule and maybe a collection of commandments that were simple and made sense, I think that what that did was it gave juxtapositions of power where I'm holy and you're sinful, right? Or I'm devout or I'm chosen and you're heathen. And instinctually, human beings, I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking about the uncanny valley, the cognitive dissonance that's created when you see something or someone that resembles you so closely and yet they're somewhat different. Well, in our history, I mean, we evolved amongst many other species of near humans, of bipedal primates, cognitive bipedal primates, and we either intermated with them to some degree, or just killed them. And for the most part, we killed them. And we killed them because we.
How do we know that?
That's throughout archaeology and anthropology. It's pretty widely accepted that we killed out all these other species. They dropped off pretty abruptly. And I believe there's evidence of Homo sapiens.
I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there weren't
destroying
fights between, but to say that there were genocides is saying something else.
Well, I know I'm not going so far as to say genocides because I think that one of those groups would have to have superior power to actually enact a genocide. But they were at war. They were competing over resources, or believed to be competing over resources, right? And so they fought. Well, I believe, and I know that there's literature in my field that also suggests that racism and hatred, right, and the differences that we see ethnically and physiologically, and any hate that is drummed up from those differences we see, is an instinctual fear. It's fear that that person will take our job, or take food off our plate, or take our wives or our mate or our children, right? It's a fear fundamentally. And that fear is useful to a certain percentage of the population. It keeps us under control, where we war against each other instead of realizing who ultimately has the strings on our
So what
fingers.
you're saying is what was at one point an atavistic, natural fear is now a manufactured fear.
All right, yes. Yes.
Are we going into adrenochrome right now? Is that what's happening?
No. Let me give you a couple of exampes from
I'm not
my
ready
field.
to embrace the cue just
We're
yet.
not going there.
All right,
We're
thank
not
you.
going there at all. Nor would I go there. But I want to talk a little bit about some common mental health diagnoses and their evolutionary psychological roots. So let's start with the concept of seasonal depression, right? We're aware of what seasonal depression is. Your energy level is lower in winter months. You're not as social. You don't have as much drive or motivation to be out there generating, being productive. Well, what animal doesn't do that? That was adaptive until the turn of the 20th century, the Industrial Revolution, and the light bulb. Now our robber baron capitalists expect us to produce even into sunset. Expect us to wake up before the sun rises because we have electric light bulbs. Why shouldn't we be starting our day and producing? So we created a disorder called seasonal depression to say that you're deviant. There's something wrong with you that you instinctually want to use less energy and conserve energy in winter months, consume less, socialize less. That was adaptive for hundreds of thousands of years, arguably millions of years. And now all of a sudden, as of the last 130 years, all of a sudden it's maladaptive now. Let's talk about the concept of anxiety, right? We're talking a lot about fear. Fear is not a bad thing. Fear keeps you from dying. I'm not arguing that our amygdala should be shut off in any way. Fear of death or harm is good for us, right? Back when edifices weren't as fortified, it would make sense for us to be afraid of climbing to the top of one. But should you feel fear when you drive over the George Washington Bridge?
That it might fall or something like that?
I mean, what are people experiencing? What are phobias, really? Phobias are, we call them fears, right? But they're really anxieties. Fear is a healthy response to something that can harm you. Anxiety is an unhealthy, maladaptive response, fear response, to something that can't or won't likely harm you, that instead inhibits your ability to function in society. So these disorders, right, anxiety, for example, it's not to say that they're not real, they're not fabricated, but they're functions of societal changes, right? We're now safe. And yet the parts of our brain that control fear are still there. Our society and our technology has evolved way more rapidly than our cognition and than our brains and our physiology. So there are still these relics of the past, like vestigial appendages, for example, right? I mean, do we need our appendix? Who's eating raw meat? You eat raw meat.
I eat raw meat.
You look like a guy who eats raw meat.
I eat
Sometimes.
raw meat.
Well, so then you might need your appendix, although I don't really think it functions in that capacity anymore.
Yeah, I thought it was for sorting out seeds or something like that. It was like
The appendix?
seed-based something, yeah.
I think appendix
like some
became no longer
enzymes,
necessary.
certain enzymes.
There are enzymes to process the proteins that are now cooked out of meats.
You know what my acupuncturist told me?
What?
He said that if you focus on your...
He said you've got holes where you shouldn't.
After that.
Oh boy.
He said that if you focus on your tailbone,
Okay.
right? So
Mine
that's
or your own?
focus on your own tailbone.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, and then if you that is a vestigial tail, right?
Yeah,
We'll call it
absolutely.
that. So if you energetically think about wagging your tail, it will actually improve your mood.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I believe it. I mean, they have a lot of experiments about phantom limb and where people are actually... Well, but doesn't that talks about mind over matter, right?
Right.
It talks about the fact that with your mind, with the power of your own psyche and your ability to control your will, you can affect your health. You can affect your mood. That's the whole goal of most of Eastern medicine, is to help people take more control over their energy. So That sounds right on par with all that.
Right on par.
You wagging your tail right now?
Maybe.
I don't want to know.
Yeah. No, I would be. I think this is really cool. This is a really awesome opportunity to have these conversations and get them out there. I think, if my goal was to expand the breadth of my impact and get more people curious about ways that they can improve their life, improve their role in society, and have a positive impact on each other, no better way to do it than joining you guys here. So maybe I got to hit up Brene Brown and see if she can get me on a TED Talk.
There you go. Aside from fear, anxiety, depression, the seasonal depression, are there any particular things that affect women versus men or vice versa? Or is it universal?
So there's a couple of interesting ideas here. So there are congenital mental health disorders that certain families are more likely to inherit. There are also mental health disorders that you're more likely to see in one sex or the other. Notice I'm not saying gender, sex. I'm talking specifically about biological men versus biological women, because
XX versus XY.
yeah, because gender is mutually exclusive. Sexual preference is mutually exclusive from gender, is mutually exclusive from biological sex, etc. Right? All those things, you could throw them up in the air and get any combination. Basically, what I'm saying. They're not dependent on each other. So there are certain mental health disorders that are more common. That might just be statistically more common, still within the bell curve, in one sex versus the other. But I think what we've realized, I know what we've realized in recent years is there's certain mental health diagnoses that folks in my field were just poor at diagnosing in different sexes, in different genders, based on societal expectations. For example, autism and ADHD. It was fairly easy to see autism in males for a long time. We still struggle to spot autism in females.
Temple Grandin and other such.
Well, right. So Temple Grandin, a phenomenal spokesperson for developmental impairment.
Lightning round time.
Great. Hit me. So in the cases of autism spectrum disorder, which now encompasses pervasive developmental disorder, what used to be called Asperger's, it's harder now to spot that in girls, in females in general. And there's suggestions that the reason is because girls are a lot more likely, while boys will dissent, right? They will argue and tussle with each other and jockey for power. Girls want to fit in. And so it's really important for them to figure out the scripts early on for how they can fit in with their clique or a clique so they're not ostracized in any way. And that makes it really hard to spot autism. Yeah. ADHD is getting more easy to spot.
But what you're saying on some level is that we have the capacity not to function autistically in that sense, based on cultural need.
I declassify students that have IEPs because even though their diagnosis hasn't changed, they've learned how to adapt and catch up to and keep up with their general education peers, despite their inherent or starting disability. They've had to work a little extra hard, but ultimately they can catch up and no longer need special education. It's the plasticity of the brain, right? I mean, it's not just the plasticity of the brain, but the plasticity of the soul, right? If you have will to achieve something, right? If a person has will to achieve something, well, it's a hell of a lot more likely that they will.
Right.
So then modalities like IEP and all that stuff can oftentimes be a trap. Could be a crutch begins as a crutch, but then becomes something that you struggle to get out of at some point.
So there's a goal in my field. The goal in my field is to determine the most clinically responsible decision, right? So our goal is to hit a window where we're meeting need, but not over-serving a population and thusly creating a crutch, making them dependent. So the goal, and I work on a phenomenal team in Chester School District. I've learned a ton since joining the team a few years ago, where we really see when there's need, and the moment there's no longer need, or the moment where we can reduce the level of intervention to a less restrictive intervention, we do that, and those kids adapt and prosper. And we often have kids that wind up being declassified, or at least move from a more restrictive environment like a resource replacement classroom where they're taken out of the class to an inclusion classroom where they can interact with gen ed peers and be a peer role model, receive modeled peer behavior, and there maybe is just a special education teacher in the same room with them. They don't even identify that those are the special education kids anymore. Those teachers help all the kids, and they work together. It's beautiful. It's how I wish it was in the 90s when I was going into school. They identified me. I was like 4 years old, and they gave me a test and recognized my IQ, and they pushed me forward. And it was like, he'll do fine. Well, yeah, I got straight A's. I graduated number 6 in my class. I got a full academic scholarship to college, but socially I was always behind. So I'm not going to push my son forward. I'm going to hold him back. I'm going to let him be a little bit older in his grade because boys mature a little bit later than girls do. Maybe who knows what would have been. It doesn't matter. I'm so grateful for the life that I have, but who knows what it would have looked like for me if I had been in the middle or a little bit older in my grade. Who knows? Maybe I'd be having this podcast.
And then from
I don't know if you'd be that cool.
No, I don't think I'd be that cool.
probably not, but from the ADD ADHD perspective,
Sure.
I've seen some videos recently where they state it doesn't really exist. It's just because boys are more active, they're hyperactive. You have sugar being injected into kids nowadays.
Yeah, I see those videos.
They're kind of bouncing off the walls. What would you say to that?
Okay, so what I would say to that, in the same vein as the conversation before about some of these diagnoses and disorders that were created, because again, in the Middle Ages, middle-aged medieval England, they weren't talking about somebody with a lot of energy as having ADHD, right? Or a person who was autistic or maybe severely cognitively impaired as having severe cognitive impairment. What they were doing is they were just killing that person, right? Or sequestering that person or isolating that person or whatever. They were the town fool. It was awful. It was inhumane. And that was happening pretty much all the way up until Geraldo Rivera busted, Willowbrook in Staten Island in the 80s. But they were mistreating people with cognitive impairment and developmental disability. Actually, the organization that I worked for in New York City, YAI, Young Adult Institute, National Institute of People with Disabilities, was they received all of those Willowbrook patients, clients, and helped them rehabilitate to some degree. But I saw trauma in 80-year-old people from their time in Willowbrook.
Same with what our psychic friend was telling us about Greystoke and
Right.
some of those.
When I was a
places.
kid, I used to break into the catacombs of Greystone.
Yeah, so,
We used to go to Greystone all the time too, but
Well,
weird New Jersey,
I loved
like
weird New
exploring there.
For sure.
There's a Potter's Field
Yeah.
in Morristown Cemetery. That
Evergreen Cemetery.
Evergreen Cemetery that has what used to say undesirables that were sent initially to Greystone and then disposed of. In essence, back in the
that's
1800s, I'm talking about.
A lot of them were mistresses and other unwanted individuals in society.
Or somebody that made somebody else's life complicated.
Right.
Right. I mean, how awful that was commonplace up until 100 and so years ago.
Right. The elites were able to just sweep it under the rug and say, okay.
Not like that
You're gone.
doesn't happen to some extent now,
Well,
right?
maybe.
They've just gotten more clever.
Perhaps.
But,
The narrative being what it is.
but your question was ADHD. Why is it that kids are being diagnosed with ADHD? It's because the way that the Rockefeller education system is structured, where we're trying to make productive workers that can follow rules.
Excuse me, Henry Ford education system?
Henry Ford. Well, yeah.
He designed
from
the-
Henry Ford, but
Right.
it was through Rockefeller. The idea is that we want people to be able to comply and follow rules and respond to bells.
To be
Shifts
factory
over to
workers,
be
good
factory
shift
workers.
workers, yes.
Yeah, that was Henry Ford's idea. These kids with ADHD, they have a lot more trouble fitting that mold, right? ADHD, I mean, I have ADHD. So,
Same here.
Yeah, me too.
I think
was
it's a
diagnosed with
superpower.
it.
I was never medicated. My grandfather he had me at the tennis courts all the time. I was in activities. I was always busy. I was studying. I was skateboarding. I was playing instruments. I was doing art. I was doing all kinds of stuff. So that might work for some kids, but I also had an intellectual capacity to be able to do all those things. Not every kid does.
Sure.
So again, another example of these diagnoses being real, but really they're a function of societal expectations. You don't fit this mold. There's some places where kids with ADHD would prosper. How are we on time?
We're good, but we should hit the lightning round pretty
Yeah,
soon.
we have about 8 minutes remaining.
Okay, perfect.
In terms of the lightning round,
Yeah.
one thing I wanted to ask you. Obviously, there's so many people today that face relationship issues. Marriage, clearly, it seems like the divorce rate consistently goes up.
Yeah.
How would you say somebody could resolve issues in relationships? Just high level. Obviously, there's so many different variations of things, whether it's
I'll try to be vague here.
cheating, whether it's people bullying each other or whatever else, just in general.
So not to beat a dead horse, but cheating and a lot of conflict that comes out of relationships is a result of fear, right? Most people who cheat or are suspicious have some degree of guilt or shame, right, and vice versa. Most people who who cheat, or have been cheated on. I mean, they go hand in hand. It's usually insecurities and fears that generate a lot of that stuff. And when people can't handle that stuff and be real about it and be honest about it and trust their partner and talk to their partner about those things, they figure out other ways to cope. We could have had a whole other conversation on negative coping skills, because a lot of the work that I've done in my career has to do with negative coping skills. As I'm looking at the glasses of Scotch and cigars on the table, everything within due bounds, right? Circumscribe all passions. But the idea is that if you're coping to avoid, right? I play D&D, I play games, or I go on hikes to avoid. I'm not really avoiding my struggles, right? I'm still tackling my struggles head on, but I'm decompressing in that way. If you use your coping mechanisms to avoid handling your problems, then they're not going anywhere. You're just delaying the inevitable and worsening them. That happens in relationships.
So from that perspective, if you're using coping mechanisms, then that means you would never heal. So
if you're using coping mechanisms as a way to avoid dealing with the problem, then it's a lot less likely that you're going to heal. Absolutely.
So then how could our viewers heal if that was the case, instead of using a coping mechanism?
Well, the process of therapy is incredibly difficult for some people. Folks in my field often say you either spend an immense amount of effort looking at yourself, breaking yourself down, understanding your flaws, being receptive to others' feedback, seeing what did or didn't work in your life, and rebuilding yourself as a better person, or you spend the same amount of effort freeing yourself from responsibility, guilt, and blame, and pointing the finger in every other direction and justifying your behavior in whatever capacity and explaining that other people are wrong about you or everybody's out to get you. There's some very unhealthy people in this world, some in positions of power.
My only quibble with that is it sets up a this or that, which is not, I think, the only totality of
this
what
or that
it is.
being
Therapy or not.
Yeah, no. So therapy's not the only answer.
Right.
But realize that therapy is also a really vague term. It doesn't just mean one-on-one counseling with a person. Therapy could be naturalism. It could be hiking. Therapy could be a hobby that's therapeutic. Therapy could be Dungeons and Dragons with your friends.
Well, you're surreptitiously therapizing your
in that case,
your player characters.
You get a lot of quality for your buck.
Yeah, I guess you do.
You would.
One of the things, Dr. Freddie Starr, who was on here last time around, we're going to go do brain scans with him, which is going to be pretty
is that
fun.
right?
Yeah.
I'd love to see mine.
So, yeah, well, we were wondering which one of our brains was going to be better used for the overall, like which one's going to light up funnier or something like that.
Who's more messed up in the head?
Right. So he's got some physical trauma from his younger years because of sports. I've got all kinds of emotional and mental trauma and other stuff from past
So I
experiences.
think we know the answer already.
Well, it'll be one of the two. It'll be interesting to see.
I'm just going to put a hypothesis out there that it's Alex.
So, one of our
Did Fred Starr say therapy is not the answer?
well, it's not that he said that because he sort of walked not that he walked it back, but he was able to. He was grateful for the fact that he was going to be able to explain better what he meant by that. What he said was it's good for certain things. Mm-hmm. If you follow a CBD workbook, cognitive behavioral therapy workbook, CBT,
while you're using CBD,
maybe while you're using CBD. And you do all the exercises and you really put your all into it, it will help you. It's a modality that can help.
It's changing your internal schemas.
But is it the best? Is it the best for that? I went through years of therapy for various things. Did it ultimately help me? To some extent around the edges it did, but did it deal with core issues? No.
Alex, just like there's a lot of bad electricians out there that'll do a shoddy job, there's plenty of bad therapists.
Oh, yeah.
You have to. There's plenty of people with stories about being in therapy for a long time. My mom was in therapy for 30 years with the same psychiatrist to treat her OCD. It's worse than it's ever been.
Wow.
Maybe try somebody else, right?
Well, the other thing is that it opens you up to certain things like gaslighting and other things like that, or giving that therapist too much control over you in how you're then everything you do in your life is now run by that therapist.
We're guided by ethics, and we should never be in a position where we have countertransference. And when we realize that there's boundary conflicts, we're supposed to ethically terminate. We're supposed to set firm boundaries. I mean, there's really a process that's been created that should be followed really concisely by ethical practitioners. And we're required, I have to have 40 credited hours of continuing education every 2 years to renew my license. That should guide my practice.
Vince says, one of our listeners says, having ADHD myself, it always felt like being a square block forced into a circular hole in certain situations. Insightful discussions. Well done, gents. Thank you very much, Vince.
Yeah,
Thank you, Vince.
I agree with that. It's my experience.
So, before we go,
okay,
just one last little tidbit.
I thought I wouldn't have enough content for you guys.
So now I'm afraid. What's he going to talk about?
Pornography.
Now? Oh, pornography.
Is it a coping mechanism, or what exactly is porn addiction?
Okay, so like any addiction, it's about releasing dopamine, right? So same thing with phone addiction, gambling. It's about triggering a response. And the people who were consulted with when developing Facebook, Reels, and Instagram and TikTok, they were mental health professionals to help the programmers devise a way to tap into sort of our inherent cognitive capacities so that it could get you coming back time and time again.
So these were ethical folks that were specifically doing unethical things.
Yeah, well, some of the I watched a video recently of a couple of Facebook executives who actually left for that reason when they realized how dangerous it was and that people were being taken advantage of. So in the same vein as any other addiction, you're coping, you're avoiding, you're triggering dopamine release, and you're not going to move away from that. You're only going to lean into that more. If what you're looking for is again, you're talking to somebody who was a therapist for juvenile sex offenders, many of whom had unhealthy pornography addictions. Is your question about the people or about the industry? Because one of the big problems is that there's a lot of deviant behavior in pornography, violent behavior, that leads young people or not young people to believe that that's typical or the way that it should be, and that's damaging to relationships.
Yeah, I was talking more about the people, not the industry.
Well, the people, like any addiction, get out in the world and socialize, right? Go be a human being. Go participate in society. Meet people. Make your own. Just be a human. Be a human and live life.
You heard it here, folks. Make your own porn.
Make your own porn.
Oh, man. I'm a respected member of my community. So what happens
you were.
I was. See what happens when I hang out with you guys.
Until the dungeon came into play.
Right. Not that kind of dungeon master.
Well, you never know.
You're not going to end on that note, right?
No,
Well,
no.
we
Probably
don't have any
shouldn't.
more time, ladies and gentlemen.
We'll talk about butterflies real quick or something.
Yeah, please. All right, let me talk about butterflies for a moment. Here's a great way to do it. Plant some native plants in your backyard. Go spend time in your backyard. Attract pollinators and butterflies and bees. Sit in nature. Unplug, disconnect, and then reconnect with what will really recharge you. And I think that's the first step, to moving us into a higher level of emotional frequency. I think that's it.
Brandon, I want
Yes,
to thank
sir.
you so much for
Yeah.
coming on the show today.
Thank
Appreciate everything.
Thank you,
I
brother.
appreciate you guys.
Absolutely.
Thank you guys. Appreciate
Thank
it
you,
a lot.
Dave, for once again doing this with me. It's always a good time, a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
And on that note, we will see you guys soon.
And
Thanks
God
again.
bless America. God bless all.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
We
God
are the
bless
brothers of the
America.
Arcana.
Thanks, everybody.
Brothers of the Arcana. We are indeed. All right.
There you go.